Good morning. We are here today to talk about best practices for resilient corridors, combining complete streets design and land use to create resilient street frontages. And of course, with a specific focus on the Wayzata Boulevard corridor. So this morning, after a brief introduction, we're going to dive into the subject of corridor transformation. We're going to run through several essentials that you need to get right in order to successfully transform a corridor: mixed use and development, complete street design and safety, parking management, and placemaking. And then we'll finish up with a brief thought on what our next steps are as a Wayzata Boulevard Corridor Committee to rethinking the future of the corridor and towards getting public outreach and really crafting a vision for the corridor that we can get public buy-in for. So just as a bit of a brief introduction, my name is Andrew Faulkner. I'm a project architect and an urban designer with Van Meter Williams Pollock in Minneapolis. We're a firm of about 50 people, headquartered out of our original office in San Francisco, and we also have a satellite office in Denver. We've been here in the Twin Cities for a little over 3 years, and we did help the city of Wayzata create your design standards last year. So a lot of you are familiar, and I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of you already. And we do work collaboratively across our offices, and we have probably a 25-year track record of working on corridor planning, among other things. So let's begin and talk about what corridor transformation is. So I think probably the best way to explain this is to start with a cartoon. This is a cartoon by Ian Lockwood, who, as far as I know, is the only transportation planner and cartoonist. He does some really great work. So this is really what our mission is as a committee, right? We take this thing on the left that you all are familiar with. It is really a lot of space designed for one purpose: to move automobiles quickly. And we run it through the thing, our committee here, this machinery, and hopefully what comes out the end is something that's more supportive to business, more pleasant to experience as a resident and visitor, and more appropriate to the city of Wayzata. So as SRF identified in our previous committee meeting, Wayzata Boulevard really does have 4 different study areas that have different identities. The area I just showed in the previous slide is the east stretch from Superior to Highway 12. That probably needs the most help. A similar commercial institutional stretch up Central to Highway 12 to the other entrance and exit ramp. There's a section in the middle through the Bluff District, Minnetonka to Superior, which the city of Wayzata did do some excellent work nearly a decade ago in taming and adding that median. There are still some improvements that could be made there, but by and large, that's a better example of, I think, what we are trying to do on the rest of the corridor. And then out on the west edge of town from Highway 12 to Minnetonka, it's kind of a much more rural, large lot residential and institutional condition. So what I'm trying to say here is that the design approaches and the goals to working on the corridor are going to differ a little bit based on what is appropriate at each area. So I think the first thing I want to convey to you today is it really takes many hands and interdisciplinary thinking to build a resilient corridor. I think one of the reasons why corridor redesigns are, I'm not going to say few and far between, but still relatively rare in Minnesota, are because it's not something that can be solved by one discipline. Traditionally, things like the eastern stretch of Wayzata Boulevard or sort of the dominion of the traffic engineer. But traffic engineers can't help you make a street that's going to be supportive of business or increase your tax base or a place where people want to be. So when we think about how to build a resilient corridor, we think about it through multiple lenses. So as I touched on earlier, there's the issue of complete street design. There's the need to accommodate mobility options in addition to vehicles and create streets that are supportive of mixed use development. There's placemaking. I mean, this is the fun stuff. This is giving an identity to Wayzata Boulevard, something that'll let you know as soon as you hit the boulevard, I'm in Wayzata, not, oh, maybe I'm still in Minnetonka. Wait, how do I get to Lake Street again? Um, and that's through design, it's through branding, it's through kind of the feel, it's also through the quality and the materials of the corridor. And obviously landscape helps a lot there as well. There's also the issue of parking management. Parking regulations need to allow for continuity along the street frontage and need to be as efficient as possible in providing enough parking, but not sacrificing the quality of the space by providing too much parking. And that's a really tricky balance to get right. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then finally, there's the issue of mixed use regulation, zoning, overlay districts, any number of tools that can allow flexibility in use and density. When you think of a classic mid-century, 20th century corridor, you probably think of fast food joints and car dealerships and things like that. It was pretty easy to develop zoning for places like that. Now, luckily for the city of Wayzata, even the worst parts of Wayzata Boulevard aren't, quite that limited. There's still been more flexibility built in over time, and a lot of thoughtful work by the city of Wayzata in the past. But the goal of zoning on a resilient corridor should be really to allow flexibility in use and to allow for density where it makes sense. And we'll take some time talking about density in a little bit too. And as I mentioned, we help the city of Wayzata with your design standards. Design standards are kind of a way to ensure quality, and fortunately, the design standards cover Wayzata Boulevard already. So that's a piece that's already more or less done. So here are some key principles when we think about how are you successful at creating a resilient corridor. Really, the most important is that you have to establish an identity for the corridor. That's why so many of those audio-oriented strips failed. Maybe there was a mall at one end of it or something like that, but it wasn't a unique place. It wasn't tied to the community it was located in. Having a clear vision about what the purpose of the corridor is will make your future decisions easier, whether those are decisions about what types of uses are appropriate, whether it's helping the city in the future once zoning is in place, evaluate development proposals and say, listen, this might not be the best place for a drive-through car wash or something like that. Resilient corridors need to elevate the pedestrian experience. You have to remember that the only businesses you enter in a vehicle are drive-throughs and gas stations. And we've heard both through our design standards process and through the previous meetings we've had here, the city does not want Wayzata Boulevard to be a place where you drive through. So improving the pedestrian experience makes businesses more competitive because it makes you get out of your car on foot, or if you have limited mobility, on your scooter, and patronize businesses. And once you're on foot, you're going by other businesses. There's a greater chance you'll stop in. So that leads me to the next point, which is, in order to be resilient, you really need to figure out how to be a sticky place, especially after the last couple of years we've all had with the pandemic. So much can be purchased online, and a great portion of shopping transition to online shopping. I'm going to be really honest here. Like, it's far easier to get cat litter and things like that delivered, paper towels delivered to your door, than it is to go get in your car, drive to the store, put them in your cart, take them back to the car, lug them out of the car, get them into the house, put them away. So when everything can be purchased online, you have to be very careful about creating an environment that will support businesses that enhance places and create places that you want to spend time. So whether that's restaurants, whether that's cultural businesses, um, the old sort of commodity-based business sector is challenged in brick and mortar today. And so we all need to think smarter about how we design places to support non-commodity businesses. You need to be smart about parking. As I said earlier, it's a really tricky balance, but the goal is to minimize the negative impact of parking on the character of the corridor, but to manage and size just enough parking to provide convenience for customers who are used to convenient connections between their cars and where they're going. So if you think about it, the goal generally is not to provide a sea of parking out front of businesses or, a strip of parking in the case of Wayzata Boulevard, but to provide parking that might be shared between multiple properties, preferably located in the side or behind buildings, and easily accessible and very well signed. So that if you're a first-time visitor to the corridor, you're comfortable and you can easily find parking, and you don't have to walk 10 blocks to get to a business. It's close, but it's not in front. You also need to plan for diversity of housing types. Let's think about housing as a customer base here, because housing and a resident population forms the customer base for businesses. The larger the lots get and the less dense the housing gets, the harder it is for businesses to be successful. They have to draw on a much larger and larger catchment area. So where you can provide density on commercial corridors, it will help support the businesses on those corridors. You also have to allow for flexibility. As we all know, we've had to be very flexible over the last few years. And even in the decade before that, the way that streets are used, designed, and planned has changed radically. So the challenge before us today is to plan for the long term, but we also need to find interim strategies to evaluate those plans and refine them. So various interim strategies can help us test ideas, figure out if they're working, and then either lean into them or, maybe we move away from them if they're not working. So we'll talk about that later as well. So the following slides kind of give an idea about how corridors transform. And I'm going to give credit here to a gentleman named Steve Price, whose firm Urban Advantage basically originated and does this work all over the place. So what you are about to see is all based on the first image. And then through Photoshop and collage, Steve Price and his firm do a really great job showing how transformation can happen. And I do also want to mention here that, this is something that SRF and Van Meter Williams Pollock can help you about or help you with when we have a little bit more organization on what the vision is for the corridor. So, this is something that could come out of this committee in order to help educate the public and connect with the public on the vision for the redevelopment of the Wayzata Boulevard corridor. So I grabbed a set of Steve Price's images that are fairly similar to Wayzata Boulevard, from the church steeple in the background and the trees. I'm guessing this is probably somewhere maybe on the East Coast, possibly New England or something like that. But location aside, this is a very familiar type of corridor, and it's really not that different than portions of Wayzata Boulevard today. The reason all of these places are kind of similar is because all of these corridors were designed to out-of-date state trunk highway standards. As we know, Wayzata Boulevard used to be a trunk highway until Highway 12 bypassed around it. So the goal behind the traffic engineering and design of these corridors was to maximize vehicular throughput. There was minimal consideration for pedestrians, bicyclists, or other forms of access. And really the goal of these places is to move people through them as fast as possible. And, if you're thinking about moving vehicles through as fast as possible, if you're a business owner, you're also seeing the wallets move past you as fast as possible, and they probably aren't going to stop. So for the purposes of Wayzata, you probably want your visitors to stop and stay for a while. So this is not really compatible with kind of the hopes and visions of Wayzata. So let's look at how a corridor starts to transform. So you see here, one phase, and I should emphasize here that the steps that these transformations take can occur in different order. This is just kind of one vision of a sequence for how a corridor might transform. So, in this case, now there's been some investment in the sides of the corridor beyond the curb line. The sidewalk has been separated from the street. Highly visible crosswalks have been added to create a little bit more pedestrian safety and to show that, pedestrians do have a place on this corridor. The landscape has been considerably improved. And most importantly, like the city of Wayzata did on the central portion of Wayzata Boulevard, a median separates traffic outside of turning pockets and helps reduce the overall width of the corridor. There's been a fair amount of research, and the width of lanes and overall width of corridor sizes is connected to traffic speed. There is a psychological effect there. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. In this step, the overhead utilities have been undergrounded. This is obviously quite expensive, but really reduces visual clutter to makes future development easier, because that work is not placed on developments themselves. The city is also taking this as an opportunity to implement standardized lighting and signage. This helps to give a definition to the corridor, and when you reach the end of the city, it'll be pretty clear because those elements will change. The other thing to point out is that pedestrian scale lighting, that lower lighting you see on poles, has been added to provide better illumination on the sidewalk and kind of bring down the scale of the infrastructure. Now, in this phase, the previous public investments are starting to pay off. You've attracted the attention of some developers, and you're starting to see gas stations replaced with mixed-use buildings. Presumably, you're replacing a gas station. The businesses inside might be a little bit more lucrative. You have some additional residents with property taxes, so you can assume that the tax base is going up somewhat. It's assumed that the city here, since everything is looking kind of similar, is guiding the form of development through some sort of zoning overlay, possibly design standards, or a zoning district. One thing to note there is that Shell gas station in the middle, maybe a gas station has remained, but now it's been screened by a liner business that's been built at the back of the sidewalk, and the gas pumps are still back behind that. And then in this phase, all the landscape has grown up, and you really see what a difference landscaping makes. So by creating the space to plant trees, you really enable the corridor to become a much more attractive place in 10 to 15 years. And then finally, in this particular example, we're assuming that the scale and the density are such that there's now a bigger ridership base, so perhaps better transit access might also be feasible on the corridor. All right, so now that we've seen that example of a corridor transformation, let's talk about the pieces that have to fall in place to achieve that vision. And I'm going to start here with mixed use development. So the Urban Land Institute makes the point that great streets are always surrounded by dense residential development. Where residential growth and revitalization is occurring, retail is primed to follow. Why is that? That's really because of what I was talking about earlier. It's saying there's more investment, there's an increase in population, and an expanding customer base for businesses. So now we're going to talk about density, which, although it's 7 letters, can be a 4-letter word in some contexts and some circles. I want to be really careful about how we talk about density here. Density does not necessarily equal height or bulk. All density is a function of the number of dwelling units in a given land area. So increased lot coverage or smaller unit sizes can produce the same density at lower heights. Conversely, one of the challenges in the city of Wayzata is that the buildings that you are seeing be developed at, for example, a 30 dwelling per unit acre density are 1.5 or 2 times bulkier than the buildings you might see at that density in a different community. Why is that? Well, that's because of how desirable Wayzata is and the land values in Wayzata, developers are proposing really big units. So the size of your units is much bigger. A 2-bedroom might be like 1,500 or 2,000 square feet as opposed to something like 800 that would be more standard. So it's still a given number of units per acre, but those units are much larger. So bulk is not necessarily tied to density. Similarly, height isn't. You can have a project on a very small site that has to be very tall to accommodate the same number of units that a 1 or 2-story building on a sprawling site could accommodate. So if you take one thing away from this presentation, I hope that you understand that density is just a ratio, and any number of things can push and pull that ratio. And these external factors have a lot of impact on the shape and form of the building. So let's talk about housing density here. And so this is a continuum of different types of density. Traditionally, what you've seen a lot of in the city of Wayzata are either single family homes. Those are quite easy to understand. And, maybe single family homes on smaller lots like you see in the Bluff District. Or you're also seeing a lot of stacked flat buildings and the occasional podium stacked flat, like, the Boulevard has a few of those. You're not, I should clarify, stacked flat buildings is it's an industry term, but basically all that means are apartments or condominiums that are located on a corridor. Often those are elevator buildings, sometimes the smaller ones aren't, but they're, apartments that have a corridor where each unit is only 1 story and there are multiple units on top of each other. These gray types in the middle, we don't see a lot of. And by and large, that's because they're generally illegal under modern zoning, which has more or less been unchanged since the mid 20th century. However, these are the types that you really see in a lot of charming neighborhoods in older towns and cities. So, if you go to around here, Cannon Falls or Stillwater, or even the southwest side of St. Paul, you'll see a lot of duplexes. You may see some townhomes depending on the type they were built. In some locations, you'll see stacked triplexes in which you have a 3-story building with 1 unit over another. The somewhat rarer are townhomes. That would be a 2-story unit over a ground floor apartment. And then cottage and bungalow courts, which are fairly common throughout the Midwest, and some good examples in Wisconsin, a lot in Chicago and St. Louis, and then also in Southern California, but not so many locally, and I'm not aware of an example in Wayzata. But you can kind of see from this graphic, each one of these types has a different unit range. And again, there's a little bit of flexibility because some of it depends on the parcel size that they're typically built on. And for context, we should be aware here that the existing blocks, and we looked at a handful of blocks, and the city helped us by going out and counting mailboxes, tend to average around 8 to 10 dwelling units an acre. And I also want to be clear that in the Bluff District, adjacent to Wayzata Boulevard, we are not looking at entirely single-family homes. There might be the perception that there's single-family homes, but there are some duplexes, and there are some small older apartment buildings. So, the Bluff District is seen as a desirable neighborhood, but it manages to be desirable with multifamily housing. So I'll go into some of these types and show some examples here. So I think a duplex is pretty straightforward. Most of us are pretty aware of duplexes, and maybe a lot of us lived in one at one or another point in our lives. The important thing to note for duplexes is that they fall under the less expensive residential building code. So they are significantly less expensive than triplexes, which fall under the commercial building code. Attached townhomes, some great examples in Wayzata, including a couple around the corner from this particular project, which are currently under construction. They may be condos, they may be fee simple. They are typically 2 residential stories over a garage, although sometimes they might also have something like a detached garage, depending on the site. Those tend to be, significantly denser than duplexes. I mentioned cottage and bungalow courts. Some of these are really lovely. It's sort of a shame that it fell out of practice by the 1950s in a lot of cities. But today they can be used to solve really gnarly site conditions. One of the the advantages of this sort of housing type, and this particular example is one that I visited in Washington, outside of Redmond, is that if you have a difficult site condition and your access is limited, other types of housing units are really tied to their parking. Whereas a cottage or bungalow court on a larger site can locate all the parking in one area, with several garages, maybe garages that have some other units over the top. And so if you have a site with marshlands, a site with a steep hillside, a site that only has road access on one side, something like this allows you to get more residential units on that site while really creating some great quality space. Another type, which I touched on briefly, is a stacked triplex. I should note here that these are probably impractical in the city of Wayzata. So instead of getting this 3-story triplex like you see in the image above, you kind of get these sprawling, lower triplexes, like in the image below. And that is because the Wayzata Code of Ordinances currently requires any building 3 stories or more that is a multifamily residential building to provide an elevator. Elevators are a couple $100,000. So if you're trying to develop a triplex, you're not going to make it 3 stories. You're going to limit it to 2 stories, however you can. So, functionally speaking, on smaller parcels, that probably means that triplexes are infeasible. And then another type, which also for similar reasons would be a challenge in Wayzata, is an attached townhome over a flat. So in this case, you have 2 doors on the ground floor, one goes into a ground floor unit, and then there's a 2-story townhouse above. This could be, something like a rental apartment. It could also be a condominium. It could be owned fee simple with the ground floor unit being rented by the person who lives in the townhouse up above. So there's some flexibility with that ownership as well. So now that I've talked about the typologies, let's talk about density. Another point I would like you to take away today is that density can be very surprising. As I discussed, it's really just relative to parcel area. So when you calculate the density, you can often be surprised. This example on left doesn't feel particularly dense. It's just kind of a little muse on a large parcel behind an existing single family home. Yet, since it's 5 units on a 9,000 square foot parcel, it clocks in at 31 dwelling units an acre, which is actually denser than we're contemplating for the Wayzata Boulevard corridor today. And the key to this is that small lot development will often be significantly more dense than much larger large lot development. So it's all just a game of numerator and denominator. As I said earlier, density is dependent on unit sizes. So smaller unit sizes will result in higher densities, whereas larger unit sizes at the same density will result in bulkier buildings. So there's some examples on the right of different types of density in the city of Wayzata. You have above looks like a single family home, but it's actually a duplex with a second unit. And then you have probably about a 40-year-old small apartment building. I think that one is either a duplex or a triplex. And then at the bottom, you have more of a stacked flat situation on the large parcel. Another point to make is that minimum densities are also important. Going back to first principles here, the goal for what we do with Wayzata Boulevard is to support Wayzata Boulevard businesses and create a corridor that will be resilient and continue to have mixed uses that thrive over time. So as I said, it's much more difficult for a given catchment area of single family homes to support robust and diverse retail, restaurants, and grocery stores than areas with denser development. Also, for a number of reasons, including available parcels and the challenge of aggregating parcels, but also for political and cultural reasons, it's easier to develop denser development on corridors than it is in interior neighborhoods. So you see a lot of cities that are concentrating as they're trying to add more housing or more mixed use development, they focus on the corridors because it's much easier to replace a gas station with a mixed use building than it is to try and allow somebody to build a mixed use building in the middle of single family homes. Minimum density ensures diverse housing choices to support multiple housing or income levels, and demographics. This is also an important point. At some point as we get older, going up the stairs becomes difficult and we're going to want to look for a place with an elevator, or we're going to want to look for a place that's all on one level. By allowing multiple family dwelling units and encouraging developers to develop various multifamily types instead of single family homes, we're creating a larger reservoir to support people to age in place in their community. Similarly speaking, on the other end of the spectrum, it can also provide more affordable units for those that cannot yet afford to buy a single family home in the city of Wayzata. And then finally, single family neighborhoods do not generally provide enough ridership for dependable transit opportunities. As we know in America, transit is to some extent, just like car ownership, subsidized. But transit agencies still have to make hard decisions about what frequency and where do they run routes. So areas with greater populations will often see better transit access, if that is something that the city of Wayzata considers desirable for Wayzata Boulevard. Finally, maximum lot sizes can also be used to encourage the subdivision of larger properties and produce compact walkable neighborhoods. This is really important. If we think about some of those parcels out west on Wayzata Boulevard, for example, one of the churches, if one of the churches were to decide to sell their land, then it'll be a big decision for the community of what you want to see out there. You could subdivide it and you could put in 2 to 3 large estates, but that will create a really long sidewalk, essentially in a rural area. If maximum lot sizes are used for future subdivision, then you could get a compact residential neighborhood, whether it be some multifamily or missing middle housing types or single family homes with limited lot sizes, then you will get a lot more development closer together and you'll create a more lively sidewalk and walking experience, which, as we noted on our walking to our Wayzata Boulevard, different portions of the boulevard feel completely different. And it does feel in some of the places that are a little bit more rural and less dense, it feels like it takes twice as long to get somewhere on foot. So if the goal of the city of Wayzata is to encourage people to walk and to bike, in addition to driving, creating these environments that are amenable to pedestrians, that are compact and that can provide the services that people need for everyday life, do hinge on some sort of maximum lot sizes. Another important identity piece is to create a small scale transition from the corridor to adjacent neighborhoods. So one example, which is up above, and we would never propose this kind of height for the city of Wayzata, was from a large plan unit development we worked on elsewhere, taking a transition from 2-story, fairly compact pre-war residential neighborhood up to this publicly owned piece of land where the municipality basically wanted to get as many housing units as they possibly could. So how do you do that without creating a giant wall behind some of these fairly nice small homes? Well, you transition the height up. And that's something that can be done through zoning. It can be done through density categories. So you might go from 2 stories to 3 stories to a townhouse to a small stacked flat building to something larger. In the case of Wayzata Boulevard, this is something that's probably more limited given the depth of the properties along Wayzata Boulevard, but it's something that should be entertained for the larger properties, such as the supermarket strip mall, if they were to redevelop, to think about how you feather that density down at the edges. Um, so the ways that you can accommodate this, I showed up above by height limits. You can do it through density requirements, also through view plane requirements. So there's an example of that at left. How do you, essentially establish a diagonal plane that requires buildings to step down the closer they get to a shared property line? All of these can ease the impact of denser corridor development, and importantly in Minnesota, to make sure that solar access is still retained for properties that are just behind the corridor. Another important consideration is to use buildings to frame the street edge. And there's different ways to do this. If we look at Wayzata Boulevard right now, especially the eastern portion, really the status quo is you have generally 1-story buildings that are pulled quite far back from the street. In some locations, you have access roads paralleling the boulevard, and you have parking between the businesses and the street. If you look at the places that are more successful on the boulevard, like the Punch Pizza development, due to just kind of some luck and incongruities in that portion of the corridor, there just happened to be trees between the property line and the sidewalk, or sorry, the street and the sidewalk, and then the property line happened to be a little further back. So they were able to take advantage of an existing buffer against the traffic. In the future, if the goal is to make Wayzata Boulevard a vibrant, kind of enticing place for pedestrians and business, thought should be given to how far new buildings should be set back from the street. And I think the challenge here is you don't want parking in front of businesses, but if you just establish a blunt kind of minimum setback, you can have unforeseen consequences. So the building at lower left, which has been fairly controversial in the community, I think one of the challenges here is because it's a commercial building, it's rather tall for 2 stories, and it's right against the sidewalk. There's minimal landscaping there. If that building was set back further and there was kind of a nice space in front of it, it would seem a little bit better. But as it is, there's sort of limited room for landscaping. It's questionable how successful those trees are going to be, for example. So instead of just doing a knee-jerk reaction and saying all businesses must be built to back of sidewalk, especially on a street like Wayzata Boulevard that currently doesn't have parking, taking a balanced approach and thinking about how you might create amenity spaces between the building and the sidewalk is very important. The depth should relate to the street design and also the street width. And as I discussed before, buildings should provide retail and main lobby entrances from the street and secondary entries from the parking located behind the building. You also need to ensure that ground floor uses contribute to pedestrian activity. So, Punch Pizza, in terms of the physical construction of that development, it did a lot of things right. As we noted on the walking tour, at least one of the businesses located in that building uses the area facing Wayzata Boulevard for storage and just has cardboard boxes piled in the window. You create policies about that, but it all depends on enforcement. Our view is that the more successful the corridor gets, the more businesses will be forced to turn their front to the corridor, and hopefully the buildings have been designed to allow that to happen. Our design standards do require clear, unobstructed glass. And as we are thinking about how the corridor gets designed and what the vision is for the corridor, think about how to provide amenity areas, places for outdoor dining, places to stop and sit, or if it's residential, terraces or stoops or porches at ground floor residential units. That helps push the buildings back a little bit more and makes the street a little bit nicer, and it also helps provide a buffer between the street and the buildings. So now we're going to move on to the next topic of essentials to cover, and this is complete street design. So we're going to get a little bit technical here and talk about how streets were designed and how that's changing. But let's start kind of from first principles. And I'm sorry, I can't remember who to attribute this to, but I remember this came up at I think it was like a Federal Reserve conference on aging in place and complete streets design. But I love it, so I'm stealing it, and sorry, whoever originally said it. If you're a business owner, it doesn't matter how good your business plan is. If somebody doesn't stop, if the wallet's moving at 40 miles an hour, you can't make the sale. So how do we get people to slow down? This is also, of course, related to safety. We've heard there are lots of serious concerns from the community with safety on Wayzata Boulevard, specifically with left turning movements, but also with pedestrian crossings and some other issues as well. And this is just basic science. The faster you move, the more your cone of vision is narrowed. Some people have kind of gone so far as to say that the human animal is basically designed for a maximum speed of 18 to 20 miles an hour, because that's like the fastest you could ever hope to sprint. And the faster we go beyond that, our physiology just doesn't work well. We're not designed like cheetahs are. So the faster we move, the more our vision is narrowed, the more traditional traffic engineering would seek to limit our vision and focus us on what is in front of us, for example, highway design. Similarly speaking, the faster we travel, the longer it takes to stop. And of course, that's somewhat of a function of vehicle size and weight, but assuming average vehicle size and weight today, the fatality rate quadruples between an accident that occurs with someone going at 20 miles an hour and someone going at 30. And it doubles again for someone going at 40. And that's really just because you can't stop in time. By the time you see somebody and slam on your brakes, it's too late. So our point really is that safety should be designed in, it shouldn't be reactive. So another great cartoon by Ian Lockwood, but traditionally the way traffic engineering works, you study what's there, and then based on what's there, then you can take action. And we're saying it should be the reverse. We should create the conditions that we want to see. So, why is it dangerous to cross the street? Is it dangerous to cross the street because nobody does it and there's no provision to help people cross the street? Or is it dangerous to cross the street because people are getting hit? It's probably both. So we really think it's got to be proven design strategies. The other important thing to understand in traditional road engineering was this concept of the 85th percentile design speed. So traditionally, every so often, whether it's every decade or whether it was triggered by other work and policies that were happening, a speed study would be conducted. And so someone would go out, like our friend here in the lawn chair, and clock speeds for a specific period, maybe a day or something. And then they would look at all of the speeds and run the statistics on it. And whatever the 85th percentile speed on that corridor was, then they would round that off and that would become the new speed for the corridor. So what does that do? Let's say you have a corridor that's 25 miles an hour, but everybody goes 35 to 40. They come out and do a speed study, and now the 85th percentile is probably 35 miles an hour. So now the speed goes up to 35 miles an hour. So then everybody keeps speeding. And now it's 35 miles an hour and everybody drives 40 or 45. Then in another decade, another speed study is done and the speed gets raised to 40 or maybe 45. Meanwhile, the corridor itself hasn't changed. And so at some point you get to a place where these posted speeds are fast enough and the designs haven't changed. The design hasn't changed, so the corridor becomes really dangerous, especially for people that aren't in cars. In addition, when new streets are designed, typically, if a policy decision was made that this street would have such and such a speed limit, the corridor design itself would be designed for 10 to 15 miles an hour faster than the speed limit to allow future speed studies to increase the speeds. So you kind of see where everything's going here, and it just ends up with things going faster and faster and faster and eventually getting very dangerous. Fortunately, this status quo has changed considerably over the past decade. So what we want to do is basically look at the corridor, figure out what we want at the corridor, what is the appropriate speed for that, and then use that to shape the technical design parameters for the street. And I should note here that the portions of the street are under the control of Hennepin County, but it's really our goal as a committee and as a city to put forth a clear vision to Hennepin County of what we want to see. And once that happens and we get organized behind that, then we can gain leverage with Hennepin County to actually demand the changes that we want to see for the portions that Hennepin County controls, namely Wayzata, which east of Superior and also central up to Highway 12. So all of that is kind of in the future. Our understanding is that Hennepin County will probably be looking at reconstructing Wayzata Boulevard, or the Hennepin County portions of Wayzata Boulevard in about 10 years. But we can make Wayzata Boulevard safer today, especially in those portions that the city already controls. So at the top here are some demonstration programs that SRF did in Dakota County. So these are, we can call them cheap and cheerful. You are basically gluing things to the street. Perhaps you're painting off a edge of a corner to get rid of a slip lane to make people slow down a little bit before they turn right so they don't right hook pedestrians. There can also sign the crosswalks. Those can be kind of problematic because a lot of times they just get mowed down by cars depending how fast people are going. There's kind of other levels of intensity. The example at the lower left was evaluating a traffic circle in town San Marcos, Texas. And so they just built a traffic circle with some potted plants, and it's called straw wattle, but that's straw and burlap bags that it's used for erosion control. So there's room to be creative and not spend a lot of money. And as I said earlier, pilot projects can be very effective for testing strategies before they become permanent. They help to gather data and they help to make a case. If people are skeptical about a potential improvement, you can test it out over a week, and it's just a week. It can go away after that week. But it's very important to remember that these temporary interventions are not a replacement for permanent solutions. So on a permanent basis, eventually we want to get to a place where we're moving asphalt and brick and concrete. We also want to design the street for all users. As I've said, design has a greater influence on traffic speeds than enforcement. There have been studies, for example, that have showed that regardless of posted speed limit, the average speed driven goes down by 5 to 10 miles an hour on streets with street trees. Why is that? Because they kind of confine your vision and they make you work harder to see what you're doing. And as a result, you're less likely to bomb through at 15 or 20 miles an hour over the speed limit. Generally speaking, design features that reduce predictability can create safer streets. As I said, street trees, and especially continuous tree cover, on-street parking, which also has the advantage of buffering the sidewalk from the traffic on the street, changes in pavement surface, decorative paving, even just paint, bulb outs, medians, and neck downs at crosswalks that reduce pedestrian crossing distance make streets more safe, but they also reduce predictability for the motorists and slow pedestrians down. And finally, flashing pedestrian beacons. That obviously depends on whether the motorist stops and yields, as is state law, but in my experience, I've found them to be fairly effective in the Twin Cities area. And the goal here is to really make Wayzata Boulevard a place where everybody feels comfortable, whether it's a senior citizen trying to cross the street using a walker, or a mother with her kids in a bike trailer, or even our friend up here, a construction worker riding a bike. I always say, I think you figured out and gotten it to work if you can get a construction worker to ride a bike and get out of their truck, but that's something else. So let's talk a little bit about street design components. There's two zones to think about. The first is the front of curb. That's really what you think about when you think about the street. It's things like traffic lanes and street parking, maybe separated bike lanes or bus lanes. It would also include the boulevard median. The part that often gets overlooked is the back of curb zone. So this is area that is not even necessarily within the right of way. The advantage for these portions of Wayzata Boulevard that are under Hennepin County control is that this is outside of the Hennepin County right-of-way by and large. So the city of Wayzata still maintains control on what happens there. The key point is to remember that the corridor should be defined from the building face to the building face, not the sidewalk to the sidewalk or the curb to the curb. So in this back of curb zone, it's up to us to define what that is and then set the land use regulations to allow for it. You can always put access easements so as a condition of development, for example. So you can have patios, you can have a walk zone, you could have a tree boulevard, you could have stormwater filtration to improve water quality. You could have amenity zones such as seating areas, trash cans, pedestrian lighting. You could have raised cycle tracks like you have on Lake Street by the new park. If you look really closely at the bottom of this slide, you'll notice that this line here marks the property line. So in this particular city, the El Camino Real precise plan we did for the city of Mountain View, it was a very broad corridor that was also a state highway. And the city went ahead beyond the property line and required an extra 10 feet of setback and then set regulations in place for what happens during that setback. And so on the left, you see your commercial. So it's largely paved. There's areas for sidewalk dining. On the right, in the areas that are developed as residential, multifamily residential, you see that there's a requirement for sort of a setback main entry. It also allows for individual stoops at each ground floor unit. So the ground floor units can be elevated above the street, but there can be a bit of a semi-private space between the sidewalk and the unit. So what happens behind the curb is really up to this committee. And it's something that SRF and Van Meter Williams Pollock can help you with to establish that identity. And then as development occurs on the corridor, you'll start to see these zones fill in. So I'd like to also talk for a little bit here about parking management. Apologies to Louis Sullivan here, but today architecture form follows parking. As a practicing architect, I can say I can't count on my fingers the number of buildings I've worked on whose form has been driven by how many parking spaces we can fit underneath the building. But in terms of Wayzata corridor, we should really remember that parking needs to support this corridor. The goal is to have a consistent pedestrian-friendly street experience that is achieved by parking behind the building. There's obviously trade-offs between parking convenience and a continuous and usable right-of-way. Largely, those can be overcome with very clear signage, purposeful access to parking, and shared parking. And there are different types of buildings that are harder than others, but if a gas station, this picture at the upper right, can get it right, almost anything can. You can put the gas station building at the back of sidewalk and put the pumps behind the gas station if the gas station has a corner site or side yard access. It's important to also think about how you create a nice way to access rear building parking from the sidewalk. This is a great example on Lake Street. So it's already been done in Wayzata. It can be done on Wayzata Boulevard. For some of those uses where parking behind the building is more difficult, for example, grocery stores, side yard parking could be a good compromise. So in this example at the left, You see a single aisle, so that would be about 60 feet wide at most, probably, of parking, and that then wraps behind the building for this grocery store. So you know exactly how to enter. It's very visible for motorists. You put the entrance on the corridor facing both directions, and it's just as convenient as walking across a fairly deep suburban parking lot to get to a grocery store. Of course, if you have parking that does abut the sidewalk, our design standards that we worked on with the city of Wayzata do require significant screening between the back of the sidewalk and the parking. It's also important to take advantage of the potential of mixed use development to be more efficient about parking. And the city of Wayzata should be really congratulated here versus neighboring cities. You have done a great job being thoughtful about parking, whether that's the municipal ramp and the Mill Street ramp here downtown, or your signage that pretty clearly directs visitors to public parking. You know, these are all good precedents for how to think about parking on Wayzata Boulevard. Similarly, the Wayzata zoning allows for on-site or off-site joint parking shared between uses, and this should be something that should be encouraged of all applicants who want to develop property on Wayzata Boulevard. You know, so this at the lower right, at the lower left is from the National Main Street Center, but it's just showing how different uses can overlap to use the same parking. Finally, on-street parking can encourage access for all users. So oftentimes it's just convenient to park on the street in front of the business you're trying to go to. But while you're parking there, you're also serving as a buffer between the sidewalk and moving traffic. If it was to be desired, parking management could encourage turnover to support businesses. I know this is pretty controversial in the city of Wayzata, and you've generally taken a different philosophy than the city of Excelsior, who's metered a lot of their downtown. Time limits and metering are also available. Probably would make more sense somewhere like Lake Street than on Wayzata Boulevard for the time being, but maybe in the distant future, something would be considered for Wayzata Boulevard. In any case, the general thinking behind metering and parking management is to set a price or have a flexible price that changes based on demand to encourage only a couple of spaces per block to be open at any given time. The thinking is, you know, from an economics perspective, if there are a lot of parking spaces full on a block, you can't find parking if you're looking for it, and perhaps you're not charging enough for parking. So there is a guy, Donald Shoup, who's written extensively about this, who's a professor in Southern California. If you're interested, I encourage you to dive into that, but it's probably a bit of a tangent for this particular study. All right, now we're at the fun stuff. So let's talk about placemaking. How do we create an identity for Wayzata Boulevard that reflects Wayzata itself? What we would suggest starting with is to break the corridor into nodes of activity. Earlier, I showed that street section from the El Camino Real Precise Plan. These are the different activity nodes that were designated on that street. So the overall philosophy here is that you look for areas that should have more activity or denser development, and the areas in between can be, you know, less active and quieter. So if you think about something like the center, the shopping center where the Lunds is versus the Bluff district, you know, it's clear that there's a difference in identity there. So maybe one of those should be considered for more activity, and the Bluff district could by and large remain what it is. And that'll break down in any number of ways. It can, as you see the images at the right, you see different street treatments at different nodes. So kind of the one at the top is just your typical residential area. You narrow the street down and create a nice sidewalk crossing, but you know, that's about it. You know, you might require there to be more plazas somewhere that's kind of a medium level of activity. And then, you know, at what were designated these activity centers, you really require some setback. You know, these were, in this case, these were designated in these locations because there were very large properties available for redevelopment. So when you have a large property, you can demand more amenities, then you could get like a nice plaza on the corner, for example. You should also figure out how to define gateways. And that's something I think we'll be talking about a lot as a committee. Gateways can set the tone for the entire corridor, or they can just delineate different nodes. So it could be a single element at the boundary. It could be a repetitive element, like we saw in those renderings by Steve Price. The city kind of used a standardized light fixture, which could be thought of as a repetitive identification element for that corridor. Or they can just show up in changes between different nodes or segments. So a couple interesting examples here, whether it's sort of a typical pylon sign or something artistic. There are more creative ideas. So the city up above is Price, on the right is Price, Utah, and they got neighbors together to paint kind of artistic crosswalks that were designed by a local artist. So that's a great way to create identity in a local business district. Gateway elements would either be typically installed and maintained by the city or by some sort of business improvement district. Of course, the question with gateways is where should they be located? And I'll touch on that right before we end in a little bit. Finally, it's very important to provide spaces for people. Corridor design is often a battle over feet and inches. So it's really our job as a committee to ensure enough room is provided either on public or private property for street furniture, sidewalk cafes, and the elements that make great places enjoyable. And I can't think of a better example than Saratoga Springs, New York. If you look at this picture up above and you look at the width of that sidewalk, if you had 5 feet, this wouldn't work. But because, whatever the history was there, they have on-street parking, they have this massive sidewalk. You can get very nice sidewalk dining. You can get benches that face the buildings. You can get really nice street trees, and it really becomes a very comfortable, nice, pleasant environment. One might call it charming. It's also important to provide front setbacks that engage the street. And so, it's unclear how much of this is a setback versus a public sidewalk, but either can serve in that function. And the amenity strips, those areas between the sidewalk and the street, could either be programmed by the city or the applicant or a business improvement district. However, minimum standards should be imposed to clarify what is not allowed in the amenity zone. For example, are bike racks prohibited? Or, are phone booths, although nobody builds phone booths anymore, but you get the idea. Are COVID bubbles prohibited? And then maintenance could either be the responsibility of the city, or more typically, it would just be the responsibility of the landowner through a development agreement with the city. And so in this example on the left, we can see what the private easement is contributing to the streetscape, and then we see what the public right-of-way is. So thinking thoughtfully about where that line should be drawn is going to be a goal for this committee after we come up with a vision. So that's a good segue to think about what is your vision for Wayzata Boulevard? When we think about character, there are really, I would say, 5 distinct nodes and some spaces in between. Out west, you have kind of suburban campus, churches, schools, retirement homes. Across the street from large lot residential. And then in the middle, you have the bluff. It's kind of a really intact, great example of a desirable, charming, compact, walkable neighborhood. You have your village hub where the Lunds is. There's a lot of sort of services businesses. It's kind of the main street for the residential neighborhoods of Wayzata and probably Orono and Long Lake as well. And then you have your arterial strip out by Highway 12. But there's also the transition zones right around Barry Avenue and around the Wells Fargo site and Superior Boulevard. So how do we treat these? Do we try to make everything the same? Do we give a distinct identity to different sections? And if we do, where should we locate gateways? So finally, and I'll wrap up here, what are our next steps? So as a committee, our goals are to craft a vision, to define what we want the corridor to be, and to prioritize the strategies we will use to get there. So this is just another graphic from the El Camino Real example, but here it's sort of a schematic of the different streets, which you see all identified. And then from the legend below, you can see that the different activity areas get different height limits, different density limits. They also get different treatments at the street. So this might be one path forward, but there's multiple ways we could achieve this. And it's really up to us as a committee to have a conversation, to think through what the vision is, to craft a shared vision, and then to figure out how that vision begins to impact the concrete of the corridor. So thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, please get in touch. And have a great day.